Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and welcome to the Future of Education. It's Monday, March 12th, 2012, and our special guest today is Mimi Ito. Mimi, welcome.
Hi, Steve. It's good to be here.
It's really delightful to have you here. You are a prolific person. It was really fun to get to know you a little bit through your work. The Future of Education is a part of my Web 2.0 Labs project, web20labs.com, trying to create places of conversation around education. We appreciate the support from Blackboard Collaborate, who provide this terrific room. Coming up at the Q and ISTE shows this week, if you're going to Q, you're going to have some fun. Fifth anniversary of what we've been calling EduBloggerCon, now called Social EdCon, the all-day unconference, for the first time at Q, not the day before, but actually the first day of the conference. Lots more fun there, a Bloggers Cafe, live stream sessions. Go to qunplugged.com, and then if you're going to ISTE, of course, the flagship event, also being changed from EduBloggerCon to Social EdCon, but the all-day Saturday unconference on education. ISTE Unplugged now has all of the details. Classroom 2.0 as well is celebrating its 5th anniversary, and as part of that we have two really fun projects. The Ed Incubator program, PBS NewsHour, is our first project, building a teacher council for their programs, as well as Classroom 2.0, the book. And kind of a fun announcement today, we're extending the deadline on the book proposals. They were to be due this Thursday. We've had a terrific group of chapters come in, really great. But we have a new event that we're announcing. It's the Social Learning Summit. This is going to be an all-day Saturday virtual event, free, sponsored by Discovery Education. And we're announcing this tonight. There'll be a blog post on it later. But because of the process of getting ready for the Social Learning Summit, many of you are going to feel overwhelmed. So we are extending the deadline for the book to April 21st. And again, this is a highly inclusive worldwide conference. Saturday, April 21st, the Social Learning Summit. More details coming out tonight on my blog and through Classroom 2.0. Also, two conferences that we're waiting for dates on. I'll turn my volume up here. Thank you, Kathy. Let's see if. Give me 1 second. I'll get through my announcements, then I'll do so. It won't. There's a setting I have to switch. Gaming and Education 2012 and the Alternate Education Conference are both waiting for scheduled dates. Those are coming up, but we do have dates for the Future of Libraries virtual conference, October 3rd through 5, and the 2012 Global Education Conference, November 12 to 16. So I'm going to turn my mic off here just for a second to adjust this volume. I apologize. I'll be right back. I guess I'm just going to have to speak up because I can't shift the volume. Anyway, I apologize. Coming up on the Future of Education, next week, Kathy Davidson on her new book, Now You See It. David Warlick comes on the 22nd. Alec Koros on social learning on the 27th. Lots more fun there, including Howard Rheingold on his new book about to come out called NetSmart. Hopefully there's something there that's of interest to you, and we'll look forward to having you join us. If you've missed any of our shows, they're all recorded in full Collaborate versions and in MP3 format, and they are available at futureofeducation.com. Last week we had a really interesting panel on Seth Godin's new ebook, Stop Stealing Dreams. Before that, David Weinberger talked about his book, Too Big to Know. Dennis Littke on Big Picture Schools. Anyway, lots there, hopefully something that's worthwhile for you. So this is when we give you a chance to indicate where you're participating from. To the left of the map now you should see some icons. You're looking for the star icon. That's the second icon down. You double click on that and then click on the map. It's also fun to have you shout out the time and the temperature where you're located. And while we do this, I'm going to try adjusting my mic again. So I'm hoping my mic is a little bit louder now. Please let me know if that's better. Oh, good. I'm so glad. Well, fun to see you here. I'm sorry I wasn't paying attention, but it looks like India, Australia, lots of North America. Sure glad to have you here. And if you're listening to the recording, we thank you for taking the time. So, Mimi, really delightful to kind of get to know you through reading. If it's okay with you, I would like to kind of go through your work through the history of the books. And I feel like you're in a very unique position at this period of time in history to tell this story. Do you kind of feel that way?
Yeah, it definitely has been an interesting journey, certainly one that I couldn't have predicted when I started my graduate work.
So am I right in the order here? Is engineering play before hanging out, messing around, and geeking out, and then before Fandom Unbound?
Yep, you have them in the right order.
Okay, so engineering play just captivated me. I was just really fascinated. Do you want to talk a little bit about the three areas or agendas that children's software fell into and how they are reflective maybe of some larger views of technology and education?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I'm so impressed that you went all the way back to that book, which was actually a book that came out of my dissertation work that I did, as part of the larger Fifth Dimension project with, guidance from folks like Ray McDermott and Mike Cole. But yeah, my focus for that was really looking at, that moment when we saw that big wave of edutainment CD-ROMs entering the market, and I was doing my research, really finishing up my research right when it was crashing as a market, but was really, had been fairly embedded within, the practice of certain kinds of families by that point, and the whole idea that kids would engage with software in early childhood was established in that era. So what I tried to do in the dissertation was to take the observations I was making of kids playing in the Fifth Dimension clubs and linking them up to the advertising and the sort of learning philosophies that the producers of the software were developing, and kind of contrasting these three strands, which I think are fairly resilient even as the technology has changed, between models of learning that are probably based on more behaviorist versus constructivist models, and kind of understanding how that gets embedded in the design of software as well as gets taken up in context of play in different ways.
So you describe them as learning, fun, and creativity, or academic entertainment and construction, or enrichment, indulgence, and empowerment. I was kind of intrigued by what felt to me like a parallel with the constructivist or Papert type of software, and the difficulty of that viewpoint becoming commercially successful. And am I right in feeling as though that's kind of a theme, that the more sort of sophisticated, thoughtful approach often is competing with the commercial and remaining sort of secondary?
Yeah, I think it's always been challenging. I think within educational approaches to technology, it's been easier to be sort of content focused, and the content tends to, or I should say for software for kids in general, the content tends to bifurcate along an entertainment oriented versus an education or academically oriented genre. And you can see that in the packaging of the software and whether it's marketed to kids or parents. But then that third genre, which is about authoring tools and construction and constructivism, and those kinds of approaches have had a much more challenging time finding market niches because they don't fit the clear genre conventions that we have established in our culture. At the same time, I do think that since I was doing the research for engineering play, that genre of making, building, tools for building where the content outcomes and the knowledge outcomes are more uncertain, that has really become much more prominent in our culture with the rise of digital authoring tools and online sharing platforms. And so I do think we're at a moment where we're seeing a broader recognition of the value of just hands-on learning and making for making's sake, which maybe wasn't quite so prominent in the early years of edutainment software.
I felt like you were also sort of fairly forthright in the book, that there was this sort of division between home and school that very well served sort of the institutional providers, and that part of the story that we're seeing now is that this constructivist piece kind of exists beyond anybody's control, and that it is reshaping our sense of where learning takes place.
I think that's right. The constructivist piece really challenges the neat boundaries we place between kids' play and learning, education and entertainment. And so it's one of these things that, it's the genre that I've been most interested in because it does play that slightly disruptive role. But yeah, I do think that, part of the challenges with my work, when I've moved more into building programs and things like that, is that it is really those dominant genres and institutions have so much power because it's not just what people think, it's how they're institutionalized and how markets are divided up. And so, when I talk to developers who are more in the construction genre, they said, well, we don't know if we should package it as like cute, parent-friendly, family-friendly genre, or the genre of software that's much more entertainment-oriented and directly marketing to kids. And based on that, all of the pathways for how it's marketed and distributed and packaged change. And I think it really points to the fact that when we're just giving kids tools to make things, there's a lot of uncertainty and ambivalence about that because we're not quite sure where they're going to go with it.
I certainly felt an interplay in all of your work between control and agency with youth. In engineering play, you talk about the software creators having a lack of understanding of the systemic process of institutional and cultural reform. I nearly fell out of my chair. I thought this was really a fascinating point, and that oftentimes innovative or experimental programs became victims of their own success, that they moved from that innovative sphere toward sort of existing social structures and norms. Without sort of diving too deeply here, is that a part of the story we saw at DML as well, at the conference? That this sort of avant-garde group of sort of Web 2.0 fans saw their kind of little playground getting encroached by big organizations?
Well, I think that's definitely the challenge, and it's part of, what I think we've seen history repeat itself continuously, where you see a small innovative group doing really awesome things that are potentially world-changing, but because a lot of the times when new kinds of innovations are funded and supported, they support the creation of a new technology or a new educational program, but they don't necessarily have a strategy for what happens when that goes out into the broader world. And so even with the early edutainment software developers, they had very progressive educational philosophies that kind of got crushed when the market descended on them in particular ways. And I think that's why we hear continuously these narratives of just oh, technology doesn't change anything. Look what's happened after every generation of new technology. And so I think we have to keep those historical lessons in mind. At the same time, I do think we've learned from some of those past mistakes. So I definitely see like what's happening right now in the conversation around educational technology and, you know, these new kind of platforms that are getting a lot of play, or online learning, you know, big universities and big funders getting into the action, that we are at risk of it just, that whole sort of weight of the incumbents kind of descending on our scrappy innovations. But at the same time, I have to be hopeful about the fact that, you know, we are at a moment where we have new kinds of networks for connecting and collaborating and having more bottom-up, end-to-end connections between innovations. And I think that there's a fairly broad-based movement towards certain progressive, or, you know, what in my earlier book I was calling these more learner-centered and constructivist approaches, having you know, a little bit more ammunition behind them than they did, you know, during the CD-ROM era.
I think that's where this is going to get fun, because when we finally get to Fandom Unbound, which is your book about otaku culture. Am I saying that right, otaku?
Yeah.
Well, it really feels as though this technology is providing kind of a unique moment where this youth contribution culture has enough power to actually potentially redefine education the way we've been thinking about it.
Yeah, I think that's right, and that's why, you know, in my own work, while I recognize, you know, the importance of understanding the big institutions and players and how organizational change works at that layer, my own studies have tended to focus on these edge players who are making a difference through these much more distributed and bottom-up kinds of practices. And so anime fandom, or otaku culture, has been such a great example of that, because it's really about fans mobilizing in a networked and end-to-end way, in ways that have completely transformed. It's a niche, but it's still an important niche within the media industry. So I think it's a great example of that, and also the fact that it's about transnational connections is also something that has attracted me to that particular community.
Well, so let's move to hanging out, messing around, and geeking out. Kids living and learning with new media. So if part of this story here is kind of control versus agency, especially for youth, was one of the things that you discovered through that research that we don't need to be as worried as we are as parents?
Yeah, it was definitely the message that sort of got taken up most broadly about our work. Was it was interesting because this book came out a few years ago, so it was right kind of on the heels of the shift to MySpace and that moment when teens really took ownership of social media. So now we're almost in a different era, but you know, our work came out when it was sort of still at the height of the moral panic of, oh my God, kids are online and they're over-connected and they're oversharing and they're meeting strangers. And so I think it's really died down in the past few years, but what really got taken up about our work was that, you know, there are learning dimensions to what kids are doing online, and it's not all bad. So that was kind of the public message that came from our work. And I think now we're seeing that, at least among, you know, certain sectors of society, that you know, there isn't quite that same sense of fear and panic, and the questions that parents and educators are asking about social media have definitely, I think, gotten more sophisticated.
I think that's true, but I feel like the document is still very current and addresses what, you know, sort of are largely still the cultural concerns about social media and youth sort of independent activity. I think it's in Hanging Out, Messing Around, and Geeking Out, or it's in one of your books, but I had actually made this in my own notes to talk to you about. I can remember when people would call our home when I was a child, and we always answered, hello, this is Steve Hargadon, or this is the Hargadon residence, whom, you know, they would ask for someone, and I'd say, whom may I say is calling, right? So everybody in the family knew where the communication was. And that clearly is very different right now.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I do think that that moment when, mobile phones and social media became, just a standard part of our communication landscape was really that moment when, the task of managing social relationships in the household and being able to monitor your kids' social relationships really shifted for parents. So I do think that we're still living through the implications for that in a lot of ways. And what I hope that our work would have provoked is sort of a shift away from that simple conversation of is it good or bad, and that simple model of, how, parenting as managing screen time in some absolute way, to really asking, more granular questions about the differences in ways that kids can participate online. And so the question isn't connect or not connect, but really the genres of participation that kids bring to the online world. And in that it really parallels the frame that I brought to the earlier engineering playbook, in that, it's not, again, like I feel like a broken record, but it's not the technology or the platform that matters, but it's really the cultural genres and the social relationships that people bring to the technology that shapes its use. And so what we were trying to do with the, those models of hanging out, messing around, and geeking out is saying, look, different kids participate differently in the online world.
You have some, what I would have said are very thoughtful, productive pieces of advice to parents and adults. About not exercising control in a way that feels oppressive to the kids, and finding activities to do with them that really build on the positive aspects of the technology. And I appreciate that you are a broken record, because I really like the thread of thought that goes through your work. But it also felt like that book in particular wanted to address specifically how these changes in the technologies and in the activities were going to impact education. And what were your conclusions?
Right. When we finished the Hangout book, we were still really, really early in our thinking about the implications for practice. I mean, we had sort of just popped our heads out after, working in this very large team over 3 years to synthesize, it was really like, what the hell are kids doing online these days? And then trying to tease out the learning implications. I mean, I think since then we've gotten a little bit better, and this I really credit to, not the research team, but the broader network of educators that I've, had the good fortune to be in touch with, but in really understanding how some of what we learned in observing kids has ties into a lot of good reflective educational practice that has looked at the fact that when young people have choices in their learning, when they're following their interests, when they're engaging in activities that are about shared purpose with adults rather than accountability, that the quality of the learning is different. And that's where, I wouldn't have predicted it when we went into the study that, this research could have tied into, the actual, design and informing of educational programs and approaches, but it's really been fantastic to learn from, colleagues who are working on the ground with young people in not just observing them, but, trying to shape their learning in particular ways. And yeah, I mean, I think the big findings were the fact that, new media is a space of interest, autonomy, production, and creativity for kids. And then the questions we had were really why more young people weren't taking advantage of those, all of those rich learning opportunities that are out there, and the fact that we did see that with productive adult participation and guidance and co-production that kids could have a lot of supports in finding those more productive learning opportunities. And the question that I really left the study with was, how could we support more environments that guided kids towards those experiences?
So it feels like there's kind of a dilemma which I think we're going to get to with the Fandom book, which is that a lot of what is seen here is not new. Right? I mean, there have been Dewey-based schools, or like Dennis Lifke came on a couple of weeks ago with Big Picture schools, or Reggio Emilia. I mean, there have been people who have seen this value in student agency and sort of directing their own learning. And yet at the same time, as we approach this from an institutional level, the dilemma is that we have a little bit of a desire to kind of control it. It starts out independent in this youth media world, and yet we look at it and think, okay, so how can we sort of manage this? So tell us about otaku culture.
Right. Yeah, so otaku culture is such a great example of, peer production and non-commercial production and network culture and all those things that are sort of the buzzwords of today's online world. But what is interesting about it is, like you say, Steve, it's not anything new. I mean, otaku culture had its origins in the 70s, and even some of my colleagues trace it back to the immediate post-World War II era in Japan, where little boys got together and geeked out on their trains. And we have one chapter by, one of my co-editors who is a train otaku from those early years. But it really is, just a form of geek culture. And really my specialty is an anthropology of different kinds of geek culture. So it's been really fun for me to see, the tremendous diversity in Japanese forms of geek culture, and then really tracing how there's these deep historical origins, but with the advent of digital technology, otaku culture kind of found its medium. So they were suddenly able to scale and expand transnationally in a way that really was not was more place-based in an earlier era. So one of the reasons why Japan has been such a rich arena for these forms of cultural remix and otaku culture is because it's a very dense, urbanly, highly connected environment. So geeks could get together and have a lot of conventions and marketplaces for buying and selling and trading products and things that really relied on a peer-to-peer infrastructure but was very place-based. But now that after the internet came along, it just radically expanded and became this huge transnational phenomena. And so that's really what our book is trying to trace. And, from a learning perspective, I think, it embodies a lot of those features of the kind of construction-oriented and peer-based learning that we're, many of us are trying to support through online platforms. But, yeah, I definitely take your point, Steve, that it's always a delicate balance between, wanting these things to emerge and self-organize and trying to bring in players who are interested in directing them in particular ways.
I know this has come up. I'm on a committee with Karen Cater on communities of practice, online communities of practice. And there is this tension between recognizing the value of what's happening independently and the inherent institutional bias toward making a difference by getting involved. And in fact, it even comes up specifically, I think, in some very connected ways with your work. They talk about bridging these networks. And sort of uniquely, the individuals are already the bridges. Could you give us some examples, for those who don't know what otaku culture is, sort of how what it is and how it has spread?
Right. So I can give an example of, for my contributions to the book, I looked at two communities that were specifically transnational in nature. The video remix community, which is mostly, I think, highly centered around the U.S., and also the fan subtitling community, which is also centered around the English language fandom. But the fan subbing community in particular is very interesting because basically what they do is they translate and subtitle anime and distribute the fan subtitled versions. And in the early years, before digital video and distribution, they did it through VHS and anime clubs where they would view together. But with the advent of digisubbing and online video distribution, the whole scene exploded, and the fan subtitled works were really what opened up the market for anime overseas. I mean, prior to that, it had been a very limited market, and now post-digisubbing, it's become sort of a major international niche form of media. So it's really an example of people, young people, self-organizing to do this incredibly backbreaking work. I mean, translating, timing, and doing subtitles, it's not fun. I mean, a lot of people think of, you know, kids' online activity as purely play-oriented, but, you know, these are tightly organized work teams, and they get hundreds and thousands of downloads of their work. So to me, it was really interesting example of for how kids can work incredibly on incredibly challenging tasks, learn incredibly sophisticated technical literacies, pick up a language like Japanese, and how having a sense of shared purpose and contributions to a broader community and working collaboratively in mixed age groups, that these are incredible motivators for participation.
So for a couple of years, I did a series of interviews with people who had been seminal in the open source world. Eric Raymond, Richard Stallman, Brian Bellendorf, Mark Andreessen, and I felt like I was talking to the canaries in the coal mine, the people who had sort of years ahead been on the front lines and were developing practices around that were based on the new connectivity. I felt the same way reading your book, and I actually, reading your Fandom Unbound book, and I actually wondered, are we adults actually going to have any role at all here? I mean, are we likely to be surprised by kind of a group like this kind of redefining learning independently in ways that we can't even imagine?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. I mean, in a way, it's already happened that, you know, you're seeing glimmers of this on the edges of our ecosystems where you're finding highly successful young people who have gotten the way where they have completely independent of the formal educational system. And so we're starting to see that happening. And, you know, for example, I interviewed, because I focus on geek kids, I know a lot of kids who are these kind of poster children for alternative ways of learning. I think my big concern with it, though, and you know, what's really been motivating the core of the collaboration I've been doing with the broader Digital Media and Learning Initiative, is the fact that the kids who are really taking to these online worlds and doing these incredibly activated kinds of things are, you know, they're a tiny minority. You know, and again, it's just stressing the fact that different kids are engaging differently with the opportunities that the online world has to offer. And they tend to track along traditional lines of privilege. And so that's the big concern. It's sort of like, you know, Bill Gibson's famous quote of, you know, the future is already here, but it's unevenly distributed. And I think that's where public institutions and interventions really have an incredibly important role to play, because we are seeing sort of this equity gap in access to these kinds of learning that I love to celebrate, but also recognize that they're not widely distributed yet.
I heard many times in your work a deep concern about equality, both from a social, economic, cultural perspective, but also from a gender perspective.
Yeah, I mean, that is one of the issues with studying geek culture, is that, you know, probably, I mean, of course, along traditional class lines, you're seeing a division, but, you know, gender is one of the most resilient ones as well. And I do think that if we are entering an era, which I believe we are, where these forms of highly adaptive, self-directed, demand-driven forms of learning are becoming more important just because our technology and social and cultural ecosystem are changing so quickly, then those of us who aren't necessarily, predisposed or have the supports for that kind of learning or that more geeky kind of activated kinds of learning, will continue to be at a disadvantage. And that's where, I think we both have an opportunity to radically expand and diversify our imagination of the pathways that kids can go on to acquire access to these kinds of networks and knowledge and forms of expertise. But we're really at a moment where there's a profound risk of a growing divide and disconnect, I think.
Can I ask you what your growing up was like? Are there ways in which your own childhood and schooling have informed your work?
Well, it's kind of interesting. Like my personal history on this is that, I have an older brother, and in our family, I was always what I call now a corporate learner. I did everything by the book. I did really well in school. I loved school. I loved, extrinsic rewards and all of that kind of stuff. And my brother was this, incredibly sort of geeky learner. I mean, he did fine in school, but I think by high school he was missing a lot of school, and he had started his first internet business by the time, in his teenage years, and he never finished college, although he tried a couple times. And so we were sort of like yin-yang from a learning perspective, and, I think part of what my work now is really trying to grapple with is my experience of growing up with an incredibly interest-driven learner, and us both having an appreciation of our different learning styles, but also understanding sort of the gaps and weaknesses of each side.
I'm actually sorry I didn't try to get your brother on the show as well, but that might have been too complicating.
Right.
Well, again, I don't want to go to a place that may or may not be comfortable, but I'm curious as to your own parents' style. And was that, you and your brother are obviously both well known. Do you think that your parents' learning style or parenting styles had something to do with that?
Yeah, I definitely think, it was partially sort of growing up bicultural and kind of having to make our own identity, and, that we didn't have a lot of, maybe my parents didn't know what they were doing, which was a good thing to a certain, in a certain sense, because they were immigrants, and, they just kind of, I think children of immigrants often have some sort of autonomy and agency that is unique to that position. So that may be part of it. But I do think that the fundamental thing, and this is something that's been borne out in the research that we've been doing on connected learners, is that that kind of social support and trust in the family in supporting kids' interests and their taking the lead from a child's interests and dispositions was really fundamental to how we were brought up, and which is why, even though my learning style was completely different from my brother's, we both really thrived in the end.
I've talked a lot lately about the need for a narrative, or sort of a larger cultural narrative to help us facilitate these shifts. And I think maybe like you, it comes from my own personal experience. I was also a corporate learner. And in fact, we have 4 children, and our oldest, the first child of 2 first children, was very much a corporate learner. And we've had to really work on our family, in our own family, to redefine the narrative. As you kind of look at the larger landscape, are there narratives around teaching and learning that you feel are compelling enough to produce a broader shift, a broader change in thinking?
Yeah, so I think that's part of why, with we've been trying to develop, and it's still really early, but this model of connected learning that's come in part from research and in part from experiments and practice and just a long history of related work in the area. But in trying to bridge those boundaries and those ideologies of learning that kind of, and which I grew up with as a researcher, that was pitting sort of formal and informal learning, or, as if it was one or the other. And so currently, what we're really struggling with is how to think of learning as something that should seek to integrate different spheres of learning in kids' lives. So the sphere of school shouldn't really be considered hostile to kids' peer interactions or to their creative interests. And, what does it take to think about the fact that kids may have different entry points into what we consider connected and activated learning. So, my entry point, we're seeing like this debate about badges and extrinsic rewards, for example. I mean, I really thrived on having clear structures, clear, rewards that were recognized by institutions. And so my entry point into connected learning was really through these more institutionalized structures, whereas somebody like my brother was just, I thought, I always envied him because he always knew what he was interested in. He always had a passionate hobby, which, I had to be handed them. I didn't have them, I didn't find them on my own like he did. And so his entry point was through the interest space. And then there's other kids who like to do things that their friends are doing, that they're very peer-oriented and friendship-oriented. And so I think if we can get to a point where it's like the learning we see, we can recognize when kids are really engaged and they're socially supported and they're doing well in sort of an adult-oriented trajectory. And these are all things that I think everybody recognizes as valuable learning, and that we can say, oh, but kids may have different entry points, and there's a diverse range of institutions and pop cultural forms and genres and that can motivate kids to come to this space. And, I think I'm having the same thing with my two kids who are very, very different learners. But, it is interesting that, confronting that within our own families and kids is a way, I think, of understanding that, it's not one or the other.
I had a really interesting thought. I was going to kind of avoid the bad conversation because I know you blogged about really wanting to sort of look at the positive potentials. But I think sort of intriguingly, they do have inherently within them a sense of external or sort of external acceptance. I have a son. We have a son who is an Eagle Scout, who got his Eagle Scout, days before his 18th birthday, and it was so interesting to us that we sent him down or asked him to go down to pick up his Eagle Scout award at the Scout office, and they wouldn't give it to him, even though he was now 18 and an adult. And I'm still intrigued by the degree to which a badging system, maybe not intentionally, but may lead toward that kind of more extrinsic thought process. We'll leave that for the Q&A, because I don't want it to sound like we're being critical. Okay, so I wanted to give you a chance to describe both the Connected Learning news site and also your research network. So I've put the news site up on the screen, and feel free to tell me where to go and kind of how to show people things. We can do the same thing with the research site, and then we'll go to Q&A.
Okay. Yeah, so the Connected Learning .tv site is really, we really took a page from your work, Steve, and how you've been doing such an amazing job in connecting people around ideas and facilitating conversation. And so it was really an effort just to, work with a diverse group of people and kind of surfacing an initial set of principles that we thought could motivate a set of conversations and inviting input. And we were working with Howard Reingold, who has been fantastic in just advising us on how we might build out conversation and community, and we oriented towards this model of having initially a set of live events that is just about facilitating conversation. And I know that if you go to the What is Connected Learning section, you'll see that we've developed a cute infographic and learning principles that was really vetted and developed in a very distributed way with a network of people. But it's really just we hope it'll be seen as perpetual beta, and we're just trying to invite conversation, and eventually we hope to curate resources and highlight what we think is a very broad and historically deep set of communities that have been working for a long time in related areas, and we're just trying to provide some of the catalysts for surfacing all of this work that people are doing that we feel relates to this model of learning, and that's leveraging new technology in order to make it more accessible. So that's the connectedlearning.tv site, and then the research network is, I consider just one component of this broader frame of what we're calling connected learning. So this is in the model of, what the MacArthur Foundation has historically funded networks of researchers to come together to do work in an interdisciplinary way around a new and emerging paradigm. So what's I think is interesting and exciting to me about our research network is we're bringing together people some of who have a lot of depth in the area that you would associate with education and technology or progressive philosophies of learning, but a lot of people who are really coming together to talk for the first time. So we have, like Sonia Livingstone, who's really known for her work in media studies outside of school, or Juliet Shore, who studies, does critical studies of consumer culture and movements around sustainability. She's an economist, and Craig Watkins come from media studies, whereas Bill and I tend to be learning people, as with Chris Gutierrez, and so it's kind of a unique configuration of people to start, a new research effort that is mining a lot of these strands of work and practice that have been going on for a long time, and to start doing empirical work to see how much these practices are disseminating or unequally distributed in the culture, and looking in more detail at both the supports and barriers for these connected learning experiences to take hold for kids.
Terrific. Okay, so this is the point of the show in which we allow the audience to ask questions. Audience, you can do this in one of two ways. You're no longer the audience when you ask a question. You can raise your hand, and that's the third icon over in the participant window. Look at the top of the participant window. You'll look for a hand, and you click on that. You can raise your hand, and we'll give you the microphone, and you can ask a question. Or you can put your question in the chat. If you've placed a question in the chat during the previous 45 minutes and I missed it, I apologize. It's hard for me to keep track of those. So please just post it again. And so if you have a question for Mimi, please feel free to do that. Mimi, what are you working on? Well, I'll ask a personal question. What are you reading right now that's really impacting you?
That's a good question. It's funny, I'm reading parenting books right now. I just picked up, I'm going to get the title wrong, but the Raising Baby, the French, on French parenting, and I, of course, read the Tiger Mom book, and, I joke to my kids that I have my very own teenagers now, and I'm having so much fun, and, what I'm really trying to learn and reflect on right now is discourses of parenting.
That's very funny. We could probably trade lots of titles. Okay, we have a quote from Lewis. How do you see this work affecting schools and libraries?
Yeah, that's such a great question, and maybe one that I'm not necessarily I work with a lot of fantastic colleagues in schools and libraries, and so I can only speak from my experience of, being able to connect with people who are more expert and immersed. But what's most exciting to me right now is the fact that, I'm somebody who's done most of my research in the non-institutionalized learning space, with kids hanging out and geeking out on stuff on their own in their social and recreational lives. And it's just incredibly exciting to me that I have partners now in the school and library space. And it's not that I haven't had companion spirits all along, but I think for some reason, through the Digital Media and Learning Initiative and just the Internet, it's become much more like I've been able to find people. And the work, I think it's also a cultural shift where there's more recognition of the kind of learning that's happening in these informal contexts. So, you know, like the work that we've been doing with the U-Media Center in Chicago, and kind of expanding this effort to a lot of museums and libraries around the country, and building centers where youth can connect with adults within sort of adult-sanctioned spaces, but centered around their interests, is tremendously exciting. And then the collaboration that Katie Salen is part of our research network, and it's been fantastic to work with her because she's been really trying to build school programs that center around an inquiry and game-based curriculum that are, again, you know, meeting kids where they are in terms of their interests, but trying to bring those interests in conversation with the kinds of academic goals that are really necessary for them in their adult achievement.
Okay, you have a question from Larry. What do you note are some cultural differences in learning from different countries, or are there any? Is the difference just the difference among types of groups, and what part does family play?
Oh, wow. That's a really big, really interesting question, but really challenging because there's so many answers to it. I mean, I think what's interesting looking across different countries, and, you know, I've been fascinated with the work coming out of Finland and Singapore, for example, and of course I know a little bit about the Japan context through my own experience, but, you know, the institutional configurations and the broadly shared cultural norms or scripts around education and parenting really do make a difference. And so, you know, the national frames, like right now, like there's been a lot of talk about the difference between the American and Finland system, and the U.S. system stresses competition much more, is much more individualized, and that results in a really different kind of institutional culture around education. So I think there's a lot there. I think from, you know, so we see differences both at a national level and also within countries. You know, there's a lot of work that's looked at, you know, class differences, the differences between immigrant families and, you know, families who have been in a country for longer. Yeah, there's so much there, and I do think that it's incredibly important to tease apart those differences, and both in how there are different approaches to learning and education, but also how that's intersecting today with different ways in which technology is taken up and regulated in the home.
You know, we've talked on the show several times about Finland, and in particular their ability to coalesce around a narrative of equity. And because we have this sort of competing interest narrative that's so deep in American culture, we've been looking for a narrative that would both be one that we already sort of believe, but would showcase a tension between that narrative and the traditional narrative of schooling. And one that's sort of consistently come up is the inherent value of every individual. You know, that your child has unique talents, and you should never be told your child is defective. Any of those resonate with you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why, you know, in our work, we've really been trying to focus on the diversity of kids' interests, the diversity of motivations that kids bring to learning, so that it isn't sort of an either or. And I think the big challenge within the formal educational system is that we're often held to sort of standardized outcomes and focus on the outputs rather than the inputs to the system. And so when kids are held to outputs, and those outputs are standardized and evaluated, you know, in relation to one another, so, you know, individual differences computed against a standardized scale, it's really difficult not to see that as a really strong message in terms of the value of their learning. But then in the interest space, it's like, even when I was doing research on Pokemon, it's like you could be a really good water Pokemon trainer, and there's a fire Pokemon trainer who's also an expert in your peer group, and you could have a lot of different trajectories for getting achievement and recognition. And when you look at really high-functioning interest groups, you often have a real diversity of roles, like you have the curator, the critic, the creator, the circulator, the evangelist, like all of these different roles in a community that isn't just about knowledge and skills-based expertise, but about really diverse forms of getting recognition and making contributions. And so that's why I've always looked to these kinds of, you know, whether it's, you know, sports or creative pursuits or, intellectual interests, that there is an opportunity to radically diversify the ways that kids' interests and capacities get valued. And I think that, I know you had mentioned the badging system, but, I think there's a lot of, positive and negative ways that badging can be taken up. But one of the ways that I think is potentially a positive opportunity is just that it can diversify the recognition systems that kids have access to.
I love that response. Okay, Donna Joy asks, have you done any research on any groups of inner city children?
Right. So my own research, so again, this is why I have colleagues, because we specialize just like interest-driven kids do. So my own research has definitely centered more on the highly technology-leveraged kind of geeky communities. But in our current research network, I have really learned so much from Craig Watkins, who's doing work right now in a school in Austin, which I don't know that I would call it an inner city school, but it's definitely not, the population of kids that I tend to see in these sort of geeked out online communities. And Chris Gutierrez, who, has done a lot of work with immigrant kids and families. And so we're definitely diversifying the lenses and populations at which we're looking at our work. And then, the sites that a lot of the new programs we're rolling out really do cater to a pretty diverse range of young people in cities like Chicago and New York City.
Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to keep plugging forward here. Verily wants to know, is there any way for us to volunteer to be part of the Connected Learning Research Network?
Oh, yeah, so this is something that we're just we put all this stuff out there and we've been getting a ton of interest and response, and we're so happy and we're so bad at figuring out the right ways for kids, for people to participate and, people, again, I think it links to the earlier question of serving kids in different locations and different programs and different sites of practice. And we would love to just, the research network is really based on, a new set of empirical studies that are both quantitative and qualitative in nature. And I think we will be seeking partners. It really depends on, is this as a researcher or as a program. We will be seeking partners in kind of broadening the research and the reach and helping inform the future directions. So I think, the quick answer is yes, definitely on the research side, most definitely on the community site, the connectedlearning.tv site, is we really welcome, not just participation in the webinars, but also, suggestions for resources, other projects, other researchers that should be featured on the site, and ways of building out the site. We were hesitant to launch with a ton of infrastructure, like wikis and forums, before we knew what the uptake would be, but we definitely want to be hearing from people and want more people to be connected to our work.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. As a courtesy to our guests, and in part because I know you have another commitment, we will end on time. But Gord says, I'm finding incredible energy in learning that has a base in building. My students are now building the very knowledge I'm supposed to be teaching them into living, breathing virtual worlds. Am I dealing with a minority?
Oh, I don't think so. I would like to believe that it's a very broad-based kind of activator of learning for kids. And I think, I'm one of the movements that gives me such hope is the whole growth of the maker movement, and the fact that, it's not just the digital and online, but these place-based programs that are dealing with building through physical materials and kind of linking that to the digital. And we're doing a case study. One of the communities that we're studying right now is Ravelry.com, which is a fiber arts community for knitting and crocheting. And it's just amazing to me how this sort of DIY make culture has been really taking off. And clearly it's predated all the digital technologies, but I think there's a way in which the digital technologies both expand the range of things that kids can make and even more importantly, give them the ability to circulate and share and connect around those sorts of activities. So I see that as a huge opportunity space.
Mimi, the hour goes so fast. I'm hovering over the smiley face, which takes me down to an applause button, and I'm clapping for you. Thank you so much for coming on. This has really been delightful.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Yes. So you've been listening to Mimi Ito. And coming up next week, Kathy Davidson talks about her book, Now You See It. David Warlick comes on after that, and lots more. Hope you'll join us again. We really appreciate Mimi coming on today and you for attending. Thank you so much. Bye now.